Dead Air Studios presents The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade, by Patrick E. Malloy, read for you by the author. This recording is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so feel free to share it with your friends or enemies, but always give appropriate credit. This story is not intended for children and contains profanity, violence, and disturbing content that some people may find offensive. If you're in doubt, please turn back now, as you may find that some doors, once opened, refuse to be shut.
Seven. The long stairway creaked as they descended. This part of the school felt different than the rest. It smelled different. Ancient dust and mold stifled the air regardless of the cleaning job done by the work crew. And there was something else layered beneath. Something sour. Rob knew in the back of his mind that he'd promised himself to steer well clear of this part of the old building. However, the mixture of cocaine in his blood and the desire to impress the pretty woman who paced behind him continued to drive him forward. At the bottom of the stairs, he took a step forward and shone the flashlight back and forth. "Looks like the boiler room," he noted. Annie stepped into the room at his heels and took a look for herself. She was not surprised to find a maze of reddish pipes arcing away from a vast industrial boiler that fed heat to the different parts of the school.
"It's cold down here,"
she said, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "Yeah." He breathed distractedly and swung the light in a wide arc. The way the shadows moved in the shifting light made the network of pipes seem to crawl. He felt Annie slip an arm around his, her small body shivering against him. The boiler resembled a great face of some disjointed jack-o'-lantern with dials for eyes and a writhing Medusa head of snake-like pipework. They inched along the long room, shining the thin beam of the flashlight into each shadow, and turned up nothing. The only thing living here were insects and bloated, phlegmatic spiders lounging in their tattered webs. At the opposite end of the oblong room, they came to an unremarkable door. "Supply closet, probably," Rob said, and broke away from her to open it. "Empty," he affirmed, peering within.
"Rob, come here. Look at this,"
she called. He turned around to look at her. She was holding her hand up, facing the wall.
"There's a draft coming through here."
He felt it too. He shone the light on the wall in the direction of the breeze and saw a thin crack running the length of the wall where the bricks were slightly uneven. He placed his palm against the stone and pushed. To their joint surprise, the wall slid back with a low grinding growl of stone on stone, revealing a wide doorway approximately 3 feet wide and running from floor to ceiling. It stopped moving after clearing about 9 inches. "What the hell?" Rob asked.
"A secret passage?"
Annie asked dubiously. "It's stuck," he said, throwing his weight against it.
"I think I can slip through,"
she said, her curiosity flaring.
"Give me the flashlight."
He handed it to her and allowed her to push through the narrow gap. Annie found herself in a cramped and extremely dusty room. At its center was some sort of altar or shrine, atop which were situated several extinct hurricane lamps, strange gleaming statues, and a hefty tome. At the room's back was a... Annie screamed and dropped the flashlight. It crashed to the floor and went out. Outside, she could hear Rob call out to her and begin slamming against the stubborn passage door. She dropped to her hands and knees, looking for the flashlight. She had to look again. There was no way she could have seen what she thought she had. As her hand closed over the handle to the flashlight, she felt someone grab her in the darkness, making her start violently before realizing it was Rob. "It's only me. It's only me," he said, shaking her. "What happened?" She switched the flashlight back on, relieved to find that it had not broken, and shone it into the gloom. The beam fell on a strange X-shaped rack, the height of a man, made of iron and affixed with 2 pairs of manacles. "What is it?" he asked breathlessly.
"Nothing,"
she said.
Just for an instant I thought I saw something."
"What?" he asked.
"A body,"
she said.
"A torso, anyway. A dismembered torso. I guess my mind is playing tricks again."
"This is creepy enough as it is," he said, approaching the rack and looking at it with obvious discomfort.
"What is it?"
she asked. "I don't know, but it appears to be some kind of torture rack. What would something like this be doing hidden in the basement of a school?" She looked at it more closely. The device was old. Much older than the 1960s, she would guess. Its surface was chipped and rough-looking, stained with a red liquid that seemed to ooze from the metal and run in thick rivulets to the floor.
Is that blood?
She asked, horrified. Rust, I think, Rob said. What the hell is this place? She moved to the altar and looked more closely. Words were painted there in Latin. Meditatus vestri poena. Meditatus sounded like meditate to her. Poena? Poem, maybe? She didn't know. What she'd taken for statues before were something even stranger. Models of insects and arachnids, each roughly 8 or 9 inches in length, made of some polished, gleaming metal. And they weren't precisely statues. The joints were articulated. They appeared to be able to move, as if they were mechanical or robotic. Thankfully, they showed no sign of doing so. At the table's center sat the aforementioned book and another statue. This one, a 4-sided pyramid covered in some kind of runic script, too appeared to have moving parts. The bottom seams were hinged, and there were horizontal separations along the triangular sides. It was all frighteningly odd. What did you find? Rob asked her, coming over to stand beside her.
I have no idea,
she said honestly, turning now to look at the great dusty tome governing the bizarre collection.
The Book of Adumbral Verses. Litany of the Morsus Libari.
She read off its cover and shrugged. She opened it to a random page and continued to read aloud.
Decay is the natural state of human life. The host body is simply an ambry used to house one's spirit as one is transported to one's eternity. Should one wish to receive the blessing of eternal life, one must be willing to sacrifice the flesh. Only through the purifying powers of pain may one earn the right to stand before the master.
Rob gaped at her and came around the table to stand beside her. Annie continued to flip through the strange book at random until she came to a set of pictures. One was a sketch of a man, face contorted in agony, suspended in the air by numerous hooks inserted into the flesh along the back, arms, and legs. The skin stretched and distended unnaturally. The artist captured the expression on his face in unnerving realism. On the opposite page was a diagram of a human body from the reverse, with marks showing the insertion points for the hooks. Before closing the book, Annie was horrified to notice that one such location was the anus.
What the hell is this?
She asked Rob, holding the book up with a terrified look. He merely shook his head and returned her expression. The pair looked around the room, now with a renewed sense of danger. It appeared as if they had stumbled across the meeting place of some kind of cult. I think we should bring this stuff back with us to show the others, Rob said finally.
Yeah.
Annie agreed.
You know, I think someone wanted us to find this. The open door, the passageway. It's like we were being led down here.
Annie picked up the pyramid, a sense of dread stealing over her, pushing out every other emotion. She wanted to get out of this place, and as fast as she could. Rob reached out to prod one of the silvery models before picking it up, scared that it might just come to life and scuttle up his arm. Once he was sufficiently satisfied that there was no danger, he gathered up 2 of them, a fat, squat beetle and a spindly, wicked-looking spider. Let's get the hell out of here, he said to Annie. She nodded vehemently in agreement. When Rob and Annie made it back to the lounge, Anton was already awake and the others were stirring. Where were you two? He asked them. I was just about to come looking for you. In the basement, Rob answered him, smiling with ascendancy. No shit? Anton asked. Steve wouldn't let me anywhere near it last night. What's it like? Creepy, Rob said, beaming, his demeanor shifting again to one of callousness in his friend's presence. We found some really cool shit. You didn't think it was cool a couple of minutes ago, Annie thought, frowning, but allowed Rob to display the artifacts to Anton. What the hell? Anton said, taking them in turn. His smile faded to be replaced with a look of puzzlement. That's exactly what we said, Rob told him. Anton turned the silvery spider over in his hands in amusement before accepting the book. He thumbed through it thoughtfully before turning to Rob. This is some kind of religious text, a cult or something. Yeah, Rob said. This is so cool, Anton grinned like a kid with a new toy. This proves there really is something to this curse thing. What do you got there? Steve asked from across the room, wiping the sleep from his eyes. Don't know, Rob told him. Annie and I found it in the basement. Some kind of weird artifacts in an old book. Actually, Rob, Anton told him, looking at the book, from the state of the book, I wouldn't say it's actually that old. I mean, who knows how old the text is, but this printing is at least relatively new. There's no yellowing in the pages or anything. Steve, come here, take a look at this. Steve complied, stretching his broad back with a clear succession of loud pops, and came over to see what they were looking at. He took the book from Anton and began to flip through it. You said you found this in a basement? He asked. Anton nodded. Annie and Rob did. It's weird, right? Very. We think it might be some kind of religious text, Rob said. Maybe, Steve agreed. Or it could be a fiction.
What do you mean?
Asked Annie. Part of some kind of story or something. Let me look at it. What about these? Asked Rob, motioning to the artifacts. We found them where we found the book. Steve picked up the pyramid. Now this is weird. Looks like some kind of container. It's been broken and repaired. Where? Anton asked. Look here, Steve said, pointing to one of the four sides. This side's different from the others. All the others are segmented, but this one is smooth. Plus, it's made of some different kind of metal. The object is mostly brass, but this side is shiny, newer. He shook the pyramid gently and was rewarded with a slight rattle, and there's definitely something inside.
There were about a dozen or so of these other weird statues there too,
Annie said.
Bugs and stuff.
Tell me the whole story, Steve invited. I was down in the basement yesterday, and I didn't see anything. Rob and Annie told him everything, though Annie let Rob do most of the talking. Steve listened quietly, nodding solemnly. After a few minutes, Tabby woke up as well and came over to listen. Her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, uncharacteristically quiet and polite due to the odd nature of the story. Anton took the book and began to peruse it as they spoke. Obviously, more excited than frightened. He seemed to think of this as a treat.
Those things look real. Like they could come to life and start moving,
Tabby said, picking up the articulated beetle. According to the text, they did at one point, Anton told her. She dropped the bug immediately. It refers to them as Entomon Machina and Arachnia Machina. They're apparently some sort of artificial life form or automaton. I'm not really sure. This thing's kind of confusing. It mentions that pyramid thing too, calls it the claustrum. Listen to this. The claustrum removed will invoke the sadist, my vessel, will seek out and return the claustrum to its anointed bearers. The vessel will be marked by fire and will kill without remorse. The vessel will give unto me everlasting flesh. So saith Ei Sotak, so saith God. Anton gave a short laugh. Ei Sotak? It sounds like something Lovecraft would have written.
What's Lovecraft?
Tabby asked. Anton gave her a pitying look. He was only the grandfather of horror. You really never heard of H.P. Lovecraft?
No,
She said defiantly.
I don't read that crap.
He was a writer, Steve said more kindly. In the early 1900s. I wrote a lot of evil gods and supernatural horrors. He wrote the Call of Cthulhu.
That sounds familiar,
She said. So you think this is fiction? Rob asked Steve. Honestly? No. I think your first guess was more right. It looks like some kind of occult religion, Steve said.
This is all pretty weird,
Annie said.
I think we should take this stuff to the police. For all we know, this had something to do with the fire back in the day.
Curse of Kettle Creek, Anton said, smiling. Yeah, Steve said to Annie. We'll take it with us when we go. Anton continued to look through the text. I always thought the school was destroyed by a bunch of disgruntled kids. I never dreamed it was the work of some crazy cult. There are chapters here dedicated to different methods of torture. A lot of them look self-induced. Sounds a bit like Catholicism.
You're really enjoying this, aren't you?
Tabby asked him. Come on, he said defensively. You can't tell me you're not the least bit intrigued by this.
No, I'm a normal human being. I don't go around looking for books on pain and torture.
Tabby, he said, waving the tome at her. It's a book. It's not gonna bite you. It's been sitting down in a basement collecting dust for 40 years. The people that actually believe this crap are long gone. Probably left this ghost town with everyone else.
You yourself said that the book didn't look that old.
She said.
How do you know the cult is gone? Maybe they're just hiding out.
Maybe I'm their leader, he said, grinning at her maliciously. Maybe I have a special flavor of Kool-Aid just for you.
Maybe you are,
She said, folding her arms.
You're fucked up enough in the head to be.
Enough already, Steve said. We really don't know what it is that we're looking at here, but Annie's right. We should let the police deal with it.
You're a fucking loser, Anton,
Tabby said.
You should join a cult. Then maybe somebody would give a fuck about you.
He ignored her, picking up the silver beetle and looked it over. The wing cover hinged back to reveal a metal wing, paper thin and razor sharp. Under that, the bug's thorax was a chiseled work of art. The attention to detail was incredible. Anton pushed too far, and the wing cover snapped off of the tiny silver hinge. Oh shit, he said. They're more fragile than they look. Steve mused. I wonder how they work. Is there any way to open it? Anton again turned the artifact over in his hands. Looks like regular old screws. This one's already broken, though, so might as well force it, he said, and threw it to the ground where it shattered. They all stared in amazement at the smashed innards of the clockwork insect. It was a mass of delicate helical gears and pulleys. The inside of the statue's hollow body was decorated with the same runic script as the pyramid the old book referred to as the claustrum. Now that's weird, Steve said. The entire inside of the bug seems to have been made of a network of gears and drive shafts. So? Asked Rob. We all thought it looked like it might actually be able to move. Yeah, Steve explained, but there's no engine, no motor. What good is all that if there's nothing to power the thing? Look here. This main drive shaft ends abruptly butted up against this strange runic seal. Wow, Anton commented. That is weird. I want to take this other one apart more carefully, Steve said, his demeanor breaking, sharing for the first time a bit of the excitement that Anton exhibited at this strange new mystery. I saw a toolbox upstairs earlier. I'm going to go get a couple of screwdrivers. I bet we could get a much better idea of exactly how these things worked if we could see it all put together. Without a second thought, the big man was up and moving from the room. Annie, shaking her head, came to stand next to Anton to look over his shoulder at the book that lay open on his lap. On the page was another drawing, this time depicting a man using a scalpel to slice open his penis, splitting the organ in two.
Jesus. I can't imagine that there's really people that would do these things to themselves,
she half whispered. Anton looked up at her amused. You obviously don't go on the internet that often, he teased.
I'm serious,
she said humorlessly.
How could someone do that? What would make someone do that?
Well, religion's a funny thing, he said in a slightly more serious tone. I was only half kidding before when I made that comment about Catholics. There are groups that practice mortification of the flesh as a way of disciplining themselves among the Catholic, and even some Jewish Orthodox monks. I've read about Opus Dei practitioners that will sometimes wear sharp chains around their legs or whip themselves as a form of self-mortification. I think they believe it purifies their spirit. That seems to be pretty much what we're seeing here, though this is obviously more brutal.
That's fucked up,
Tabby said behind him. Sure it is, Anton agreed without turning around. But that's true of a lot of religious practices. Look at what the church did during the witch trials in Salem.
Well, witches are evil, right?
Tabby asked. Anton turned this time. You're an idiot, he scolded her. It's ignorant people like you that caused most of this shit to happen in the first place.
What? Are you a witch or something, Anton? Or a Satan worshiper?
She asked him in a mocking tone. No, he said, going back to reading. I'm an atheist. I think even the nobler religious practices get twisted into horrible things. Too many atrocities have been committed in the name of so-called God. If there really was a God, he never would let things like that happen.
Religion makes people moral,
she said.
Without it, everyone would be out there doing whatever the fuck they wanted. Raping, murdering.
He shook his head with a chuckle. The only thing religion does is make people into sheep. It makes them easier to control. Steve stood, gripping the screwdriver he'd come looking for, suddenly sure that someone had entered the room behind him. He turned to face the figure in the doorway, but the darkness lent no clues as to the newcomer's identity. Steve silently damned himself for not thinking to bring along a flashlight. "Who's there?" he called out to the stranger. The other did not answer, nor did it make a move to show itself. It stood motionless in the doorway, watching Steve intently. "Who's there?" he called again angrily. He held the screwdriver to himself like a weapon or a talisman, willing the other to show themselves. Still, it didn't move. Cloaked carefully in the shadow of the doorway, its presence there mocked him. Like a footprint in the snow to be lost in the greater blizzard, Steve's life would have gone completely unnoticed if not for the encounter he had in the science lab of the rebuilt Kettle Creek High School that morning. Like the spokes of a great wheel that alternately lifts us high and crushes us beneath, tragedy was on its way back around again. And it was that tragedy, and those that would follow, that would put the name Steve Murray on the tongues of people across the state of Pennsylvania in the weeks to come. Steve Murray was born in Jackson, New Jersey, to Morgan and Marie Murray, the youngest of 3 brothers. He spent most of his younger years in their combined shadow, neither as gifted or intelligent as his older siblings in the eyes of his parents. He was passed over by his mother and took the brunt of his drunken, abusive father's violent attacks. Large for his age, when Steve reached high school, he turned to football and wrestling to take his mind off of his tortured home life. Acting out in class at least won him friends. His father's violent nature manifested itself in him as he turned to bullying other children, and his size ensured that he had few enemies. He married his high school sweetheart and moved to Chester right after high school, primarily estranged from the rest of his family. When his mother died in '83, he didn't even attend her funeral. With the birth of his daughter, Lynn Murray, Steve had finally found what he'd been missing his whole life, a family that he wanted. His wife and young daughter were the world to him. Then, in 2007, tragedy found the Murrays. Lynn was struck and killed by a speeding motorist on her way to a friend's house in late October. She was 17. That same year, Sarah left Steve for a man she met on the internet after 27 years of marriage. Their relationship had never been able to heal from the shock of their daughter's death. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Steve had taken up another of his father's favorite pastimes, drinking heavily. Steve noted that it had been hours since his last drink. He wondered if that had anything to do with the shaking in his hand, or the phantom his mind told him was standing in the doorway. He further noted that he could sure use one now. "If that's Anton or Rob, I swear I'm gonna shove this screwdriver so far up your ass." Steve could feel his heart beating in his chest, flushing blood to every part of his body, throbbing in his toes and his fingertips. His nerves were alive with electricity. He didn't actually think that this was one of the men that he came here with. He knew instinctively that this was someone else, and that their intent was malicious. He could feel the other's eyes on him, waiting for him to make a move. It stood in silent vigil, like a cat stalking a smaller animal it intended to play with before eating. Though the room did not yet hold any school desks, being a science lab, it did contain a row of long, hard-topped islands with working gas burners. Steve slid slowly between the islands, keeping his eyes locked on the dark figure in the doorway. From his pocket, he produced a small disposable lighter. He tipped the chrome handle down to get the gas flowing. With a whoosh, he lit the gas stream, which plumed high into the air in a long jet of flame that lit the room in deep red. For an instant, the thing in the doorway was illuminated, but only for a moment. The man, if it was a man, was enormous. It wore some kind of mask over its face, long and black, elongated, like the head of a great dog. The light reflected off of the eye sockets, which were large, empty rings filled with some kind of glass or shiny, clear plastic. A moment was all he had to see his opponent. As soon as the gas jets flared, the thing was on the move. It came toward Steve with incredible speed for something so big. The colossal form crashed into him, its shoulder colliding with his broad chest and sending him sprawling backward onto the island behind him. He tipped back, sliding across the polished surface and toppling backward. His head collided painfully with the table surface behind him. Tiny pinpoints of light flooded his vision. Steve could hear the other turn off the gas, and the room was once again plunged into complete darkness. He pushed himself back into the corner, cowering like a frightened child. His hand went back to touch his aching head and came back wet with blood. He wondered vaguely if he had a concussion. The big man lay motionless on the floor for a long moment, waiting for the other to attack, but it seemed intent on playing with him first. Something so massive hardly had to keep itself hidden, but it seemed content to do so just the same. Steve peered around the side of the island nearest him, and he could just make out the doorway. It was open. If he could make it before the other could strike again, he would be free. He could warn the others. He could not determine where the creature was or from which direction the attack would come. He slid himself into a frog crouch, ready to propel himself to his feet, but they wouldn't move. His fear pinned him to the ground. "Go, damn it," he whispered to himself quietly. "Why won't you just go?" The last word escaped from his mouth as a cry. He sprang forward like a runner leaving the starting block, but came up short as the great shadow detached itself from the greater dark and rose up before him. It was easily a foot taller than him. He instinctively lashed out at his opponent, drilling into its chest with a powerful right hook. It was like punching stone. The creature was knocked back several inches by the force, but hardly even seemed fazed by the blow. Steve made to run around his attacker and through the open door, but a sturdy limb came up to block him, catching him across the collarbone and flipping him onto his back again. Between having the wind knocked out of him and the darkness of the room, Steve found himself completely disoriented. He tried in vain to flip himself onto his hands and knees, but the attacker was on him in a second, crashing against him again, sending him sprawling and sliding across the floor to smash jarringly into the wall below a large square window. In the half-light of the storm-darkened sky that peeled in through that window, he saw his attacker again more clearly. The other's muscular frame was inhuman, more like some kind of gorilla than a man. Its hands, which were each the size of a man's head, seemed to taper to short, jagged, claw-like tips. This was no man. It had to be some kind of animal. It came down on his abdomen with a heavy, booted foot. The first blow knocked the wind from him again. The second forced his stomach to empty its contents in a throat-burning jet. The third and fourth broke his ribs, and then splintered them. Steve rolled himself away from the attacker with every ounce of strength that he possessed. Still, the enormous thing continued to kick him in the back and shoulders. Steve scrambled, searching for something, anything to defend himself with. Then, he saw the forgotten screwdriver, lying a foot away. He made a lunge for it. His fingers closed on it as the heavy-booted foot made contact with his tailbone. Blinding pain shot up his spine as his coccyx bone split, but he managed to keep his grip on the screwdriver. He swiped backward with the makeshift weapon. The angle was too shallow, and he met only empty air. He fell back against the thing's leg. It was like the trunk of a tree. He wrapped an arm around it to steady himself and guarantee a target. He would not miss a second time. Again, calling up an astounding amount of will, Steve threw everything he had into the attack and drove the head of the screwdriver several inches into the monster's shin. The creature groaned painfully, but it did not falter. In the next instant, Steve felt himself being pulled roughly to his feet. There was a jarring blow as the creature struck again, this time hitting him just below the shoulder blade. Something felt wrong. There was a numbing coldness in his back, and he could not draw breath. Steve stumbled forward, his hands coming to rest on the window pane before him. He tried with all his effort to inhale, but something was restricting his breathing, weighing heavily on his chest. Finally, he was able to draw a small, gasping amount of air, but his lungs went into spasms in response and pumped outward in a shuddering cough. Blood shot from his open mouth, painting the window red. He realized with horror that the creature must have punctured his lung. If he didn't get help immediately, he was going to drown in his own blood. He was going to die. One clawed hand grasped the side of his head, palming it. Then, a sharp pain tore into the side of his neck as the other hand drove something sharp into his exposed flesh, just below his jawbone and behind the ear. The screwdriver. He could actually feel the flat metal blade in the back of his throat, pinning his tongue. Exotic black flowers were blooming now in front of his eyes, obscuring his vision. A funeral bouquet. Steve's thoughts went to Sarah. He would never see her beautiful face again, never smell her perfume. His world was full of pain, but it hardly seemed to matter. He was far away and distant. And then he was being lifted, hoisted into the air like a child by the creature that was killing him. He collided with the window, shattered and tumbling into the open air. The last thing Steve Murray saw before he died was the snow-covered ground rushing up to meet him. The only modicum of good luck he had at all was the fact that he struck the ground head first, snapping his neck like a twig. He was finished suffering. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you like what you've heard so far, please consider supporting my Patreon. I try to do this for free, but I do have to support myself somehow. Also, physical copies of my books are available